Rain lashed against the carriage windows, blurring the warm lights of the Freeman estate into jagged, mocking streaks of gold. Bexley didn't look back. In her lap, a feverish 6-month-old whimpered his small fists, clutching a damp wool blanket. She left with a single trunk of outdated dresses, 3 silver coins, and the stinging memory of her husband's voice as he welcomed Genevieve back into his home. They thought she would quietly waste away. They severely miscalculated. Heavy oak doors do not slam in the Freeman estate. They click shut with a suffocating velvet finality. Bexley stood in the center of the master bedchamber, listening to that click. The sound echoed in the space between her ribs. The room smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, a scent she had spent 3 years learning to associate with safety. Now it just smelled like a trap. She has nowhere else to go, Bexley. Abner's voice had been low, perfectly modulated, echoing from the drawing room downstairs just an hour prior. He hadn't looked at her. He had looked at the fireplace, watching the embers die while Genevieve sat on the damask sofa, her delicate shoulders trembling in a perfectly choreographed display of grief. Genevieve's husband was dead. Her estate was bankrupt. And Abner, the noble Duke of Westford, was simply doing his duty by offering his childhood love a permanent wing in his home. Bexley dragged a leather trunk from beneath the heavy mahogany bed. The floorboards groaned a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the stifling quiet of the manor. She didn't feel the dramatic weeping sorrow the balladeers sang about. She felt a cold, acidic nausea rising in her throat. She hated Abner for his hypocrisy, for dressing up his lingering lust as charity. But to her deep and secret shame, she also hated herself. She hated that, an hour ago, standing in the drawing room smelling Genevieve's cloying jasmine perfume, a pathetic, desperate part of her had wanted to drop to her knees and beg Abner to choose her. She shoved that thought down, burying it under a layer of cold pragmatism. Her hands, pale and trembling, slightly moved with mechanical efficiency. She packed 3 modest dresses, wool not silk. Silk wouldn't survive where she was going. She grabbed a pair of sturdy leather boots. Then, pausing by the washstand, she picked up a heavy silver spoon engraved with the Freeman crest. It was a petty thing, a foolish thing. But her fingers curled around the cold metal, feeling its smooth, heavy ridge, and she shoved it into her bodice. Let him notice it was missing. Let him wonder. From the adjoining nursery, Lyndon began to fuss. It wasn't a loud cry, just a congested, miserable whimpering. Bexley abandoned the trunk and hurried in. The nursery was drafty. Abner had promised to have the masonry fixed before winter, but Genevieve's tragic letters had consumed his attention instead. Bexley lifted the heavy, feverish bundle of her son. Leo's face was flushed, his small chest rattling with a cough that had settled deep in his lungs 2 days ago. He smelled of sour milk and baby sweat. Shh, she breathed, pressing her lips to his unnaturally warm forehead. We're leaving Leo. She carried him downstairs. The manor was quiet save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The servants had made themselves scarce, sensing the shift in the house's atmospheric pressure. Abner was standing by the front door. He looked tired. He looked like a man inconvenienced by the messiness of the lives he ruined. You are being unreasonable. Abner said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper so as not to disturb the woman sleeping in the guest wing. I told you you will want for nothing. You can remain in the east wing. Genevieve is merely a guest. She is in your bedchamber, Abner, Bexley said. Her voice didn't crack. It sounded hollow, scraped clean. Abner's jaw tightened. She was distressed. I merely sat with her until she slept. Bexley looked at his collar. The top button was undone. A faint smear of face powder dusted the dark velvet of his lapel. She didn't point it out. It wasn't worth the breath. She adjusted Leo in her arms, feeling the damp heat of his small body seeping through her bodice. I have arranged a carriage. Abner continued, his tone hardening into that familiar lordly cadence when he realized she wasn't going to argue. It will take you to a cottage in Oakhaven. It is a modest holding, but sufficient. An allowance will be sent monthly. He reached out his large, manicured hand, brushing against Leo's blanket. Bexley flinched, pulling the baby back so sharply that Abner's hand dropped. A flicker of genuine anger crossed his aristocratic face. "He is my son as well, Bexley." "He is an inconvenience," Bexley corrected quietly, "to both of you." She didn't wait for his reply. She turned her back on the Duke of Westford, stepped out into the freezing autumn rain, and climbed into the waiting, unheated carriage. As the wooden wheels churned through the gravel, sinking into the mud of the long driveway, Bexley rested her head against the rattling window pane. The leather seat smelled of wet dog and old dust. She closed her eyes, clutching the silver spoon in her pocket until the edges bit into her palm, drawing a single, sharp drop of blood. 5 years is not a long time in the grand span of history, but it is an eternity when measured in mud. Oakhaven was a village that existed perpetually in a state of damp decay. It smelled of rotting windfall apples, wet ash, and the iron-heavy tang of well water. Bexley knelt in the dirt of her small garden, aggressively yanking a stubborn cluster of weeds from the soil. Her fingernails were chipped-rimmed with stubborn black earth. The pale, soft hands of the Duchess of Westford were gone, replaced by hands that were calloused raw and frequently blistered. She wore a faded, shapeless linen dress that chafed at her shoulders. Her dark hair, once pinned with pearls, was tied back with a fraying piece of twine. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt across her brow. "Mother," Bexley sat back on her heels, the joints in her knees popping in protest. Lyndon came barreling around the corner of the lopsided cottage. He was 5.5 now, a creature of bruised shins and boundless feral energy. He had Abner's strong, square jaw, a cruel genetic joke that Bexley had to look at every single day, but he had her dark, watchful eyes. He was holding a dead, half-plucked chicken by the legs. "Mr. Higgins said we could have it." Leo panted, his chest heaving. "A fox got to it first, but he said the breast meat is still good if we boil it fast." Bexley's stomach gave a complicated lurch of hunger and disgust. "Bring it to the block, Leo. Don't let it touch your trousers. I just washed them." Survival had stripped Bexley of her pride, leaving behind a jagged, pragmatic core. Abner's promised monthly allowance had arrived for exactly 3 months before stopping entirely. She had written to his solicitor, once swallowing her dignity, and received no reply. The silver spoon she had stolen on her way out had bought them a winter's worth of firewood and flour. After that, she learned to mend clothes for the village women, to scrub floors at the local tavern, to forage for bitter greens in the woods. She didn't miss Abner. She didn't miss his voice or his touch. But on the nights when the winter wind howled through the cracks in the cottage walls, when Leo shivered under their single wool blanket, Bexley felt a burning, toxic hatred that kept her awake until dawn. She hated them for being warm. She hated Genevieve for sleeping on goose down while her son ate fox-bitten scraps. She took the chicken from Leo, laying it on the wooden chopping block. She raised the cleaver. It came down with a dull, wet thwack. Before she could raise it again, the ground began to vibrate. It was a subtle trembling, at first easily mistaken for distant thunder. But the sky above Oakhaven was a clear, bruised purple of early twilight. The rumbling grew louder, resolving into the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of heavy hooves. Leo dropped his stick and hid behind Bexley's skirts, his small fingers gripping the coarse linen. Bexley froze, the cleaver still in her hand. Into the muddy, rutted center of Oakhaven rode 20 men. They did not belong here. Their armor gleamed with an obscene, polished brilliance in the fading light. Their cloaks were dyed a deep, rich crimson, a color that cost more per yard than the entire village was worth. At the center of the cavalcade flew a banner bearing the golden stag of the royal house of Alaric. The villagers stopped their evening chores, staring in dumbstruck silence. The captain of the guard, a massive man with a scarred jaw and a heavy iron-gray beard, pulled his destrier to a halt right in front of Bexley's leaning picket fence. The horse snorted its hot breath, pluming in the crisp air, smelling heavily of oats and sweat. The captain dismounted. His boots squelched in the muck, a disrespectful sound against his immaculate armor. He unlatched the gate and walked up the short path, his eyes sweeping over the dilapidated cottage, the dead chicken, and finally settling on Bexley. He didn't look at her with the casual disdain nobles usually reserved for peasants. He looked at her with a strange, nervous reverence. Bexley Ramirez. His voice was gravelly, used to shouting over battlefields. He used her maiden name. I am Bexley, she said slowly. She didn't drop the cleaver. The captain took a step back, and to the absolute shock of the watching villagers, dropped to one knee in the mud. The mud swallowed his polished greave up to the ankle. Lady Bexley, he corrected, bowing his head. I bring urgent tidings from the capital. The king is dying. Bexley's grip on the cleaver tightened. The wood of the handle dug into her calluses. The king's health is a tragedy, I am sure. But I am a washerwoman, sir. You have ridden a very long way to tell me something I cannot change. The captain looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. Your mother was Elspeth Ramirez. She served as a lady-in-waiting at the royal court 30 years ago. Bexley's heart gave a slow, heavy thump. Her mother had never spoken of the court. She had raised Bexley in quiet, reclusive obscurity until she died of a fever when Bexley was 14, leaving her as a ward to a minor lord who eventually married her off to Abner. Modian, the king. The captain continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the village. Was secretly wed to Elspeth before his coronation. The Privy Council forced an annulment and exiled her, but the marriage was consummated. The marriage was binding. He paused, looking at the small boy peeking out from behind Bexley's skirt. The sweating sickness took the crown prince and his brothers last winter. The captain said, his voice dropping lower. The realm is without an heir. His Majesty has spent the last year searching for the child he abandoned. He found you. Bexley couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy with the stench of the dead chicken and the rich, dusty scent of the royal guards. I am a woman. Bexley said the words tasting like copper in her mouth. The law forbids a woman from taking the throne. That is true, my lady, the captain said. He slowly rose, pointing a thick, leather-gloved finger at Leo. The boy blinked, his dark eyes wide and unblinking. But it does not forbid her son. The king has formally acknowledged your bloodline. Lyndon is the sole living male heir to the throne of Ethelgard. You are commanded to return to the capital immediately. Bexley looked down at her son. He had a smudge of dirt on his nose and chicken blood on his shoe. 5 years ago she had been thrown out of a manor like a stray dog. Now the crown of the realm was being offered to the boy clutching her dirty skirt. A slow, terrifying realization bloomed in her chest. A kingdom meant armies. A kingdom meant laws. A kingdom meant absolute, unmitigated power. She looked back at the captain. She didn't smile, but something dark and cold shifted behind her eyes. She finally lowered the cleaver. Let me wash my son's face, Bexley said, her voice eerily calm. A king should not smell of wet feathers. The journey to the capital was an exercise in sensory whiplash. Bexley traded the bruising, splintered wood of a peasant's cart for the suffocating luxury of the royal carriage. It was lined with midnight blue velvet that smelled overwhelmingly of dried lavender and expensive leather. It was a smell designed to mask the rot of the outside world, but to Bexley it felt like sitting inside a very ornate coffin. Leo hated it. For the first 2 days, the boy who used to wrestle stray dogs for a scrap of bread sat rigidly on the plush cushions, terrified to touch anything. The royal seamstresses who had ridden with the guards had forcefully scrubbed him down in a tin tub at the first inn they reached, peeling away layers of Oakhaven dirt to reveal pale, aristocratic skin beneath. They dressed him in stiff, high-collared tunics of spun wool and silk. The fabric chafed his neck, leaving an angry red rash. He scratched at it constantly, his small face pinched in misery. Stop that, Leo. Bexley murmured, gently pulling his hand away from his collar. It bites me, Leo complained, staring out the glass window at the passing countryside. I know, Bexley said, smoothing his dark hair. But you must wear it. The armor gets heavier from here. She herself had been coerced into a gown of deep emerald silk. The fabric slid against her skin like cold water. The ladies-in-waiting had gasped in poorly concealed horror at the state of her hands coating her calluses in heavy salves that smelled of mint and camphor. They tried to thread pearls into her hair, but Bexley had refused. She wasn't a porcelain doll returning to the shelf. She was a survivor stepping into a viper's nest. When they finally passed through the towering iron gates of the Sun Palace, the sheer scale of the architecture pressed down on her. The palace was a monolith of white marble and gold leaf, beautiful and cold. As they were escorted through the sweeping corridors, Bexley felt the eyes of 100 courtiers on her. They bowed, they scraped, but she could hear the rustle of their whispers like dry leaves in a graveyard. The washerwoman, the bastard's daughter, the mud-born regent. She kept her spine steel straight. She didn't let her eyes dart around in awe. She let her gaze sweep over them with flat, bored indifference. Let them think she was arrogant. Arrogance, they understood. Vulnerability would get her killed. They were brought immediately to the king's chambers. The transition from the airy, bright corridors to the king's bedroom was violent. The air here was stagnant, thick with the overpowering stench of myrrh, stale urine, and impending death. A massive four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in heavy burgundy curtains to keep out drafts. Bexley approached the bed, slowly holding Leo's hand in a vice grip. The man lying among the pillows did not look like the terrifying monarch from the coins. He looked like a fragile, hollowed-out bird. His skin was paper-thin, stretched taut over prominent cheekbones mottled with age spots. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. His rheumy, yellowing eyes rolled toward them. He stared at Bexley for a long time. She stared back. She didn't feel a daughter's love. She felt a profound, chilling emptiness. This man's cowardice 30 years ago had condemned her mother to heartbreak and Bexley to a life of disposable misery. Elspeth, the king rasped, his voice sounding like dry stones grinding together. "My mother is dead," Bexley said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any comforting warmth. The old man flinched slightly. His gaze drifted down to Leo, who was hiding half behind Bexley's emerald skirts, staring at the dying man with wide, frightened eyes. The king raised a trembling skeletal hand. "The boy," he wheezed. "Come closer." Bexley gently pushed Leo forward. The king didn't touch him, lacking the strength. Instead, he looked at the boy's face, tracing the lines of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. "He has my brow," the king whispered. He let out a rattling sigh, sinking deeper into the pillows. "The realm needs strength. The wolves are at the borders. The council. They will try to swallow him whole." He shifted his gaze back to Bexley. The haziness in his eyes cleared for a brief, sharp second, revealing the ruthless politician he had once been. "You survived the dirt. Can you survive the silk?" "I survived a man who thought I was nothing," Bexley replied, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "I can survive a room full of men who think I'm stupid." The king let out a short, wet bark of laughter that devolved into a violent coughing fit. A physician rushed forward with a cloth, but the king waved him away. "Good." The king gasped, a grim smile pulling at his cracked lips. "Good. You are regent until he is of age. The decree is signed." He closed his eyes. The audience was over. 3 days later, the king died. The coronation was rushed, a flurry of incense, chanting priests, and heavy gold. Leo sat on a throne that was comically large for him, his small legs dangling inches from the floor. He wore a crown of intertwined gold oak leaves that kept slipping over his left ear. But he sat still, terrifyingly still, absorbing the gravity of the room as hundreds of nobles knelt before a 5-year-old boy. Bexley stood to the right of the throne, one step down her hand, resting lightly on the ornate carved armrest. She wore black velvet stark and severe, devoid of any jewelry save for the massive, heavy gold signet ring of the regent on her right index finger. It was cold against her skin. From her vantage point, she looked out over the sea of bowed heads. Dukes, earls, barons, the most powerful men in the continent pressing their knees into the hard marble floor for her son. Her eyes tracked the rows, moving methodically through the colors and crests of the noble houses. And then she saw him, near the front, kneeling among the high lords, Abner Freeman, Duke of Westford. He was wearing mourning black, his dark hair immaculately styled. Beside him knelt a woman in dark silk, her head bowed in practiced elegant submission, Genevieve. Bexley's heart didn't race. Her breath didn't catch. Instead, a profound, icy calm settled over her. She stared at the top of Abner's head, studying the way his shoulders tensed under the velvet of his doublet. He didn't know yet. The nobles had been summoned to pledge fealty to the new king, but the name of the boy and his mother had been kept tightly under royal seal until this very moment. The high septon stepped forward, unfurling a heavy parchment scroll. His voice boomed through the cavernous cathedral, echoing off the stained glass windows. "Lords and ladies of Ethelgard," the septon cried out, "rise and bear witness to your sovereign, King Linden, first of his name, born of the royal line of Alaric, and to his mother, her grace, Lady Bexley, Ramirez, Queen Regent of the realm." A collective rustle of fabric echoed through the cathedral as the nobles rose to their feet. Bexley didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes locked on one specific man. Abner stood lifting his head to look at the throne. Bexley watched the exact moment the blood drained entirely from his face. She watched his mouth part slightly, his eyes widening in a visceral, paralyzing shock as he looked at the boy on the throne, and then shifted his gaze to the woman standing beside it in black velvet. Bexley did not smile. She didn't gloat. She simply tilted her head, maintaining dead, unblinking eye contact with the man who had thrown her away. The silence stretched between them across the massive hall, thick and heavy. "Yes, Abner." She thought the heavy gold ring digging comfortably into her finger. "You are going to want for nothing." Incense clung to the tapestries long after the cathedral emptied, leaving a sickly sweet film on the back of Bexley's tongue. She sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table in the council chambers. Her back ached. The black velvet gown, though immaculate in its tailoring, felt heavier than a chainmail hauberk. She kept her hands folded in her lap, hiding the slight tremor in her fingers by digging her newly manicured nails into her palms until she felt the comforting bite of pain. Outside the heavy oak doors, the coronation feast raged. Faint strains of lute music and the dull roar of drunken nobility filtered through the thick walls. Inside the chamber, the air was suffocatingly quiet. Abner had requested an audience, not through the proper channels, not through the seneschal or the master of petitions. He had cornered a young, terrified page in the hallway and sent a note written on a scrap of linen. It was a desperate, sloppy move. It proved how badly he was panicking. When the heavy doors groaned open, Bexley did not stand. She didn't even adjust her posture. Abner stepped into the room. 5 years had altered him, though not in the ways poverty had altered her. He had grown thicker around the waist, his jawline slightly softened by rich food and complacency. But his eyes were wide, darting around the cavernous room before landing on her. He stopped 10 paces from the table. The smell of his cologne sandalwood and sharp cloves drifted across the space between them. Once she would have buried her face in his neck to inhale that scent. Now, it smelled like an unventilated cellar. "Bexley," Abner said. The name cracked in half as it left his throat. "You forget yourself, Duke Freeman," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It didn't need volume. The acoustics of power amplified it for her. "I am the Queen Regent. You will address me as your grace, or you will be escorted to the dungeons for insubordination." Abner flinched as if she had struck him with a riding crop. His face flushed a dark mottled red, and he dropped awkwardly to one knee. He looked utterly ridiculous in his mourning clothes, a man used to giving orders now bowing to the woman he had discarded like old linen. "Your Grace," he choked out. He stayed on the ground for a long, agonizing moment before Bexley offered a negligible flick of her wrist, permitting him to rise. He stood swallowing hard. I did not know. If I had known who you were, who the boy was, I would never have what Abner Pexin Monoson." Bexley interrupted, tilting her head. She observed him the way one might observe a dying insect pinned to a board. You would never have thrown your pregnant wife into the mud. You would never have moved your paramour into my bed before my sheets were even cold. She let the silence stretch, watching him sweat. Your morality is entirely dependent on the titles of the people you abuse. That is a dangerous flaw in a lord. I provided for you. Abner stepped forward, his voice rising in defensive desperation. I arranged the cottage. I promised an allowance. An allowance that stopped after 3 months, Bexley stated softly. She leaned forward, the heavy gold chain of her office clinking against the mahogany table. Did you know, Abner, that when Lyndon was 3, the winter was so harsh the rats tried to crawl into his cot for warmth? I killed one with a firewood log. I broke its back. I had to scrub its blood off the floorboards with my bare hands because we could not afford a maid. Where was my allowance then? Abner's mouth opened and closed. He looked physically ill. My steward, he handles the accounts. I assumed. You assumed we were dead, she corrected flatly. Or you hoped we were. It makes no difference now. Bexley, please. He took another step closer, lowering his voice into a pleading, intimate register that made her stomach turn. We were husband and wife. We shared a life. You know my heart. I made a terrible mistake. Genevieve, she was a childhood fancy, an obligation. It is you. It has always been you. The lie was so clumsy, so breathtakingly arrogant, that Bexley actually felt a flicker of genuine amusement. It didn't reach her eyes. Genevieve Hastings. Bexley mused, testing the name on her tongue. I notice she is wearing Freeman rubies tonight, a childhood fancy you adorned in my family's jewels. Abner froze. He looked down at his boots. Bexley stood up. The scraping of her heavy wooden chair sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She walked slowly around the edge of the table, her velvet train whispering over the stone floor. She stopped 2 feet away from him. He was taller than her, but he seemed to shrink under her flat, dead stare. You are not here to beg for my heart, Abner, Bexley said, keeping her voice dangerously low. You are here to beg for your lands. You are terrified I will strip you of your title and beggar your estate as vengeance. I am asking for mercy, he whispered, looking anywhere but her eyes. Bexley studied the nervous pulse hammering in his throat. A wild, feral part of her, the woman who had chopped off a dead chicken's head to survive, wanted to scream for the guards. She wanted to watch him dragged away in irons. But that was a peasant's revenge. She was a regent now. Mercy, Bexley repeated, tasting the word. She reached out and delicately adjusted the collar of his mourning doublet. He shuddered at her touch. I am not going to strip you of your title, Abner. I am not going to execute you. You will return to your estate tomorrow. You will live a long, healthy life with Genevieve. Abner's eyes snapped up to hers, a pathetic, desperate spark of hope igniting in his chest. Your Grace, thank you. I swear I will be your most loyal. But Bexley cut him off, her hand dropping from his collar. She took a step back, the air between them suddenly freezing. You will find the kingdom is a very large, very complex machine, and unfortunately for you, my hand is now on the lever. She turned her back on him, walking slowly back to her chair. You are dismissed, Duke Freeman. Enjoy the feast. It will be the last rich meal you eat in a very long time. Ruling a kingdom is rarely done with swords. It is done with ink. Parchment has a distinct dry scent, dusty and ancient like powdered bone. Bexley lived her life surrounded by it now. 3 months had passed since the coronation, and the relentless machinery of the state had consumed her entirely. She slept in snatches, waking in cold sweats, her mind racing with grain tariffs, border skirmishes, and the endless, exhausting sycophancy of the court. She was sitting in her private solar, the afternoon sun, casting long, golden, geometric shapes across the floorboards. Across the room, Leo was kneeling on a velvet cushion, violently smashing 2 wooden toy knights together. Smite him! Leo shouted, his voice echoing shrilly off the plastered walls. He slammed the red knight into the blue knight, snapping the blue knight's wooden arm clean off. Die! Bexley rubbed her temples, feeling a headache beginning to bloom behind her left eye. Lyndon, lower your voice. Leo didn't look up. He picked up the broken blue knight and threw it at the wall. It left a faint scuff mark on the silk wallpaper. He was a traitor. I executed him. Thomas says kings can execute anyone they want. Thomas was a minor lordling's son they had brought in as a playmate. He was a sycophant in training. Bexley closed her ledger. She felt a cold, deep panic uncurling in her chest. The transition from the mud of Oakhaven to the marble of the Sun Palace was poisoning her son. In the village, Leo had been wild but kind. He had shared his meager bread with stray cats. Now surrounded by people who bowed to his every whim and told him he was chosen by God, he was becoming cruel. Thomas is a fool, Bexley said sharply. She stood up and walked over to her son, kneeling awkwardly in her heavy skirts, so she was eye level with him. She grabbed his small, frantic hands. They were soft now. The calluses from climbing oak trees were gone. You are the king, Bexley said, her voice dropping to that serious, uncompromising tone she used with the council. That does not mean you can destroy whatever you please. It means you carry the weight of everything you break. Do you understand? Leo scowled, his lower lip jutting out. I want a new knight. You will play with the broken one until you learn to fix it, Bexley commanded. She stood up, her knees aching. She loved him so fiercely, it felt like a physical wound, but she could not coddle him. A weak king was a dead king. She had to forge him into iron, even if the hammer blows hurt her more than they hurt him. She turned back to her desk. Lord Chancellor Harrington was due to arrive at any moment, and she had one final document to review. When Harrington entered, he bowed deeply. He was an older man, shrewd and weathered, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He had initially viewed Bexley with thinly veiled contempt, expecting a naive, uneducated peasant he could manipulate. Bexley had spent her first month quietly dismantling his political allies until he realized she was a viper hiding in the grass. They had reached a comfortable, wary respect. Your Grace, Harrington murmured, unrolling a map of the western provinces onto her desk. The revised trade routes for the spring thaw, as you requested. Bexley leaned over the map. Her eyes traced the winding blue lines of the rivers and the jagged brown peaks of the mountains. The western provinces were rich in timber and silver. They were also the ancestral seat of the Freeman family. The river tolls. Bexley pointed a manicured finger at a junction near the Blackwood Forest. Reroute the main merchant barges north through the Crown's land. Bypass the Oakhaven tributary entirely. Harrington frowned, leaning closer. Bypass it, Your Grace. The tributary flows directly through the Duke of Westford's lands. The tolls from those barges account for nearly 60% of the Freeman estate's annual revenue. If we divert the merchants, Westford will lose thousands of gold pieces by midsummer. I am aware, Bexley said, her voice devoid of inflection. It will devastate the local economy. Harrington pressed cautiously. Duke Freeman may not have the coin to maintain his levies for the winter garrison. He may be forced to take loans from the Iron Bank. Then he will take loans, Bexley replied, picking up her quill. She dipped it in the inkwell, the black liquid gleaming like wet tar. And when he defaults on those loans because his timber exports have been subjected to the new crown tax I implemented last Tuesday, the bank will seize his outer properties. Harrington stared at her. Slowly, the political reality of what she was doing dawned on him. She wasn't just adjusting trade routes. She was executing a flawless, bloodless siege. Your Grace, Harrington said quietly. If you push a cornered animal, it will bite. Duke Freeman still has friends in the lower courts. He has sycophants, Bexley corrected, signing her name at the bottom of the decree with a smooth, sharp flourish. The scratch of the quill was the only sound in the room. And sycophants only stick around as long as the wine flows. Cut off his coin, Harrington, and you cut out his tongue. He will be begging to sell his wife's rubies by autumn just to buy firewood. She pushed the parchment across the desk. Harrington took it gently, as if the paper itself were hot to the touch. "As you command, Regent," he said, bowing lower than usual before backing out of the room. Bexley sat alone in the quiet solar. She looked at her hands. They were clean, smelling of rose water and expensive oils. The blisters were gone. But deep beneath the manicured nails, she still felt the phantom grit of Oakhaven mud. She pressed her palms flat against the cool mahogany desk, steadying herself. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired. But as she listened to Leo quietly attempting to fit the wooden arm back onto his broken toy knight, she knew she would do it all over again tomorrow. Frost crept up the leaded glass windows of the Freeman estate, thick and opaque like cataracts on an old dog's eyes. Inside the master bedchamber, the air held a damp, bitter bite. The rich, honeyed scent of beeswax had long vanished, replaced by the greasy, suffocating stench of cheap tallow candles. They smoked aggressively in the iron sconces, spitting sparks, and leaving a film of black soot on the painted ceiling. Abner sat in a high-backed chair, wrapped in a heavy, scratchy wool blanket that smelled sharply of mothballs and damp storage. He stared at the open ledger on his lap. The numbers blurred together. His fingers, pale and slightly blue at the knuckles, gripped a dry quill. The ink in the crystal well on his desk had frozen solid overnight, cracking the glass down the middle. He was ruined. It had taken exactly 6 months. Bexley had not sent a single soldier to his gates. She had not accused him of treason. She had simply choked him to death with paper. By diverting the merchant barges north, she had severed his main artery of coin. When he tried to compensate by raising the tax on his tenant farmers, a mysterious royal decree arrived capping agricultural tithes to protect the realm's winter stores. When his timber shipments finally made it overland to the capital, Crown inspectors quarantined the wagons for a month, claiming a fear of the wood rot until the buyers backed out. The Iron Bank had sent their final notice yesterday. It wasn't sealed with wax, just tied with a cheap string, a deliberate insult. They were seizing the outer farmlands by the end of the week. "The fire is completely dead, Abner." Genevieve's voice cut through the freezing room. She stood by the massive mahogany wardrobe, pulling a folded silk gown from a velvet-lined trunk. She was wearing 4 layers of wool, but she still shivered. Her blonde hair, once perfectly coiffed, hung in limp, unwashed strands. The estate's hot water required servants to haul and boil it, and all but 3 of the kitchen staff had abandoned the manor a month ago when their wages dried up. "I can break down the chair in the drawing room." Abner muttered, his voice hoarse. "The wood is dry. It will burn." Genevieve stopped folding. She looked at him, and for the first time in their lives, the practiced, doe-eyed adoration she always wore was gone. In its place was a flat reptilian calculation. It was the exact same look she had given him 5 years ago, right before she convinced him to cast Bexley out into the rain. "You are not chopping up your grandmother's furniture to keep me warm for one more night," Genevieve said. She turned back to the wardrobe and pulled out a heavy leather traveling case. Abner's stomach bottomed out. A cold sweat broke across his freezing skin. "What are you doing?" "The roads are impassable." "The roads to the coast are clear." Genevieve replied, her voice brisk, devoid of any trembling sorrow. She didn't look at him. She unlatched a small cedar box on the vanity. Inside, resting on black velvet, lay the Freeman rubies. Heavy ancient stones set in dark gold. Bexley's family had brought them into the marriage. Abner watched Genevieve pick them up. Her pale fingers traced the cold stones. She didn't hesitate before dropping the necklace into her leather bag. "Put those back," Abner said. The command sounded hollow, echoing pathetically in the large freezing room. "They are the only things of value left in this tomb," Genevieve snapped, finally turning to face him. Her delicate features were pinched, aged by the harsh winter and the terror of impending poverty. "You promised me a dukedom, Abner. You promised me safety. Look at you. You are a beggar sitting in a freezing castle reading a ledger of debts. I am your husband," he shouted, throwing the heavy ledger onto the floor. The loud smack of leather on wood startled a rat in the wainscoting, sending it scurrying away. I took you in when you had nothing. You took me in because it stroked your vanity to play the savior. She countered, her voice dropping to a vicious hiss. You wanted a fragile little bird to sing for you instead of a wife who demanded your respect. Well, the bird is freezing to death. I wrote to my cousin in the Southern Isles. He has secured a carriage for me at the village inn. Abner stood up, the wool blanket falling to the floor. He felt a sudden violent urge to grab her, to shake her, to demand the loyalty he believed he had purchased with his betrayal of Bexley. But as he looked at Genevieve clasping her traveling cloak, he realized the terrifying truth. She was a mirror. She was doing to him exactly what he had done to Bexley. She was cutting her losses, abandoning a sinking ship for a warmer hearth. Genevieve, please, Abner whispered. The anger dissolved, leaving behind a pathetic, begging whine. If you leave, I have no one. Genevieve fastened the silver clasp at her throat. She picked up her bag. She didn't look back as she walked toward the heavy oak door. Then you finally have exactly what you deserve, she said. The door clicked shut behind her. The sound echoed in the space between Abner's ribs, final and absolute. He stood alone in the freezing room, the smell of burnt tallow coating his tongue, listening to the heavy silence of an empty house. Pine boughs and roasting meats failed to mask the sharp metallic smell of anxiety in the great hall. Winter Court forced the nobility indoors, packing them into the echoing marble corridors of the Sun Palace, like rats fleeing a flood. The heat from the massive iron braziers was suffocating, making the air ripple and distort. Bexley sat on the raised dais, a rigid statue in dark amethyst silk. The high back of her carved oak chair dug uncomfortably between her shoulder blades, a constant reminder to keep her spine straight. Beside her, Leo squirmed. He was wearing a tunic of spun gold thread that scratched his neck. He kicked his velvet footstool in a rhythmic, irritating cadence. Thump, thump, thump. Lyndon, Bexley murmured, not moving her lips, her eyes scanning the crowd of courtiers below. Stop kicking. I am bored. Leo complained, his voice whiny and loud enough to make the nearby guards shift uncomfortably. Lord Harrington is talking about wheat again. I hate wheat. Bexley reached out her fingers, wrapping around Leo's small wrist. Her grip was tight enough to startle him, but not enough to bruise. She leaned in the heavy gold chain of her office, clinking against the armrest. You will sit still and you will listen. She whispered, her voice a razor blade wrapped in velvet. These men are deciding if you are strong enough to keep your crown. Boredom is a luxury for children. You are a king. Leo blinked, his dark eyes widening. He stopped kicking. He straightened his back, mimicking her rigid posture. Bexley released his wrist, a pang of guilt, sharp and bitter in her chest. She hated breaking his spirit, but she knew the monsters in this room would devour him if he showed weakness. Lord Harrington continued droning on about grain yields in the eastern provinces. Bexley half listened, her mind calculating the logistics of moving grain before the snowdrifts blocked the passes. Then the heavy doors at the back of the great hall groaned open. The murmuring of the court died instantly. The silence swept from the back of the room to the front like a wave of cold water. Bexley didn't flinch, but her eyes snapped to the entrance. A man was walking down the center aisle. He did not look like a duke. His riding cloak was threadbare, stained dark with mud and melting snow to the knees. His boots squelched against the pristine white marble. He wore no sword, no signet ring, no gold chains of house affiliation. His face was hollow, his jaw covered in a thick, patchy, unkempt beard. He smelled of wet wool, stale sweat, and cheap ale. The crowd parted around him instinctively, pulling their silk robes away, as if his ruin were contagious. Abner Freeman stopped 10 paces from the dais. Bexley stared down at him. She felt no sudden spike of adrenaline, no triumphant rush of vengeance. Looking at the broken man shivering in the heat of the braziers, she felt only a profound, heavy exhaustion. She remembered the smell of his sandalwood cologne. She remembered the warmth of his hands. Now he looked like a stranger, pathetic and small. Abner fell to his knees. The sound of his bones hitting the marble was a sickening hollow crack in the dead silence of the hall. "Your Grace," Abner rasped. His voice was ruined, shredded by the freezing wind of his journey. Bexley didn't say a word. She let him kneel. She let the entire court stare at him. "I come to petition the crown." Abner continued, his voice shaking. He didn't look at her. He stared at the hem of her amethyst gown. "The Iron Bank has seized Westford. They have locked the gates. My tenants are starving. I have nothing. I throw myself on the mercy of the regent." Whispers erupted around the hall like hissing snakes. A duke begging for scraps in open court. It was unprecedented. It was political suicide. Bexley slowly stood up. The rustle of her silk sounded unnaturally loud. She walked down the 3 steps of the dais, stopping just out of arm's reach of the kneeling man. The smell of him made her stomach turn a sour, desperate odor of a man who had lost everything. "Duke Freeman," Bexley said. Her voice carried flawlessly cold and perfectly modulated. "The crown does not interfere in the private debts of its lords. If you mismanaged your estate to the point of foreclosure, that is a matter for your creditors, not your king." Abner's head snapped up. His eyes, rimmed red and bloodshot, locked onto hers. He looked wild, unhinged. "You did this. You strangled my trade. You poisoned the banks against me. You took everything." The guards at the base of the dais stepped forward, their hands dropping to the hilts of their swords. Bexley raised a single finger, halting them. "I took nothing. Abner," she said. Her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him, though the front row of nobles surely heard. "I simply stopped giving you the benefit of my mercy. I let the world treat you exactly the way you treated me." Abner stared at her. His chest heaved. Desperation clawed at his features, stripping away the last remnants of his dignity. He looked past her, his eyes finding the small boy sitting rigidly on the carved oak seat. "He is my son, too." Abner suddenly screamed, his voice cracking violently, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "He carries my blood. You cannot deny me my own son." A collective gasp echoed through the court. Lord Harrington stepped forward, his face pale with outrage, but Bexley didn't move. She didn't blink. She turned her head slightly, looking back at Leo. The boy was gripping the armrests, his small knuckles white. He looked terrified of the screaming, filthy man on the floor. He didn't recognize his father. To Leo, Abner was just another monster from the bedtime stories, loud and dangerous. Bexley turned back to Abner. The icy calm in her chest crystallized into something unbreakable. "The king's father is dead," Bexley said, her voice ringing out with terrifying clarity. "His Majesty carries the blood of the royal line of Alaric. He has no connection to the ruined house of Westford." She looked down at Abner, her eyes flat and empty. "You are mistaken, beggar. You have no son." Abner's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He collapsed forward, his hands pressing flat against the cold marble, his shoulders heaving with dry, silent sobs. "Guards!" Bexley commanded, turning her back on him and walking slowly up the steps of the dais. "Escort this vagrant from the palace. If he approaches the gates again, throw him in the dungeon." She sat back down beside Leo. She reached out, taking his small, trembling hand in hers, holding it firmly. She didn't watch as they dragged Abner away. She just stared straight ahead, listening to his boots scuff against the marble, knowing she had finally utterly erased him. Charcoal smoke drifted from the hearth, stinging Bexley's eyes as she stared at the parchment scattered across her desk. Sleep was a luxury she had long ago bartered away for survival. It was 3 a.m. The palace was wrapped in a suffocating, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic clinking of the armored guards patrolling the corridor outside. Bexley rubbed her temples. Her fingers caught on a coarse, thick strand of hair at her temple that had turned completely silver. She was 29, but she possessed the stiff, aching joints of an old woman. Power did not preserve. It petrified. "Your Grace is working too late," Lady Catherine murmured. Catherine stood by the washstand, wringing out a hot linen cloth. She was a young woman from a minor northern house possessing a round, unremarkable face and hands that smelled perpetually of rosewater and almonds. Bexley had chosen her as a lady-in-waiting specifically for her blandness. She was supposed to be safe. The Eastern lords are disputing the winter grain levies. Bexley said, her voice dry and hoarse. She didn't look up from the ledger. If I sleep, they starve a province to prove a point. You must drink something at least, Catherine insisted softly. She walked over to the desk, placing a steaming silver goblet of mulled wine near Bexley's elbow. The spicy, rich scent of clove and cinnamon masked the underlying dampness of the stone room. Bexley reached for the goblet. The metal was warm against her perpetually cold fingers. She raised it toward her lips, her eyes still scanning a row of figures detailing wheat yields. Then she paused. It wasn't a conscious thought. It was a visceral animal instinct honed by years of watching shadows and waiting for the knife in the dark. She lowered the cup, letting it rest against her lower lip without tipping the liquid. The wine smelled of cloves. Yes. But beneath the heavy spice there was a faint, sharp tang. It smelled like crushed cherry pits. It smelled like bitter almond. Bexley didn't drop the cup. She didn't gasp. She slowly set the silver goblet back onto the mahogany desk. The heavy thud of the metal base echoed like a drumbeat. Catherine, Bexley said. Her voice was terrifyingly gentle. Yes, Your Grace. Catherine stood by the fire, her hands clasped in front of her. She was chewing the inside of her cheek. It was a nervous habit Bexley had noticed months ago. Come here. Catherine walked over. Her steps were uneven, dragging slightly on the heavy wool rug. She stopped on the opposite side of the desk. I am suddenly terribly exhausted, Bexley said, leaning back in her chair. She pushed the silver goblet across the polished wood. It stopped mere inches from Catherine's hands. Drink this for me. It is a shame to waste good wine. The blood drained from Catherine's round face in one sudden horrifying rush. She looked at the cup. Her breathing hitched a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet room. Your Grace, I could not. It is your private vintage. I am ordering you to drink it, Bexley said. She didn't raise her voice. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture perfect. Catherine stared at the dark red liquid. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. She reached out her fingers, hovering over the silver rim, shaking so hard she looked as though she were seized by a sudden fever. She couldn't touch it. Instead, her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the floor, the heavy silk of her skirts billowing around her. Lord Harrington. Catherine sobbed, pressing her forehead against the cold floorboards. He said you were destroying the realm. He said the boy needed a council of men, not a madwoman. He has my brother in the dungeons. Your Grace, I had no choice. Bexley looked down at the sobbing girl. 5 years ago, Bexley would have felt a surge of adrenaline, perhaps even a flash of pity. A sister trying to save her brother, it was a deeply human motive. But as she stared at Catherine's shaking shoulders, Bexley felt absolutely nothing. The core of her chest was entirely hollow, scooped out by paranoia and betrayal, leaving only a cold, dark vacuum. Harrington. The man she had spared, the man she had trusted to execute her orders against Abner. He had smiled at her today in the council room. He had complimented her dress. You always have a choice, Catherine, Bexley said flatly. She stood up. The scraping of her chair was loud and ugly. You simply made a terrible one. Bexley walked to the heavy oak door. She didn't look back at the girl crying on the floor. She opened it and looked at the 2 royal guards standing at attention. Take Lady Catherine to the black cells. Bexley commanded, her voice ringing down the empty corridor. And assemble a squad of men. We are paying a late-night visit to the Lord Chancellor's chambers. She closed the door, turning back to the empty room. She walked over to the desk, picked up the poisoned goblet, and poured the dark red wine onto the burning logs in the hearth. It hissed violently, sending a plume of foul-smelling smoke into the air. Bexley watched the fire die down, feeling the heavy gold ring on her finger. She had won another day, but the victory tasted like ash on her tongue. Rain lashed against the leaded glass of the great hall, blurring the gray morning light into jagged streaks. Bexley stood by the tall windows, listening to the drumbeat of the storm. It sounded exactly like the rain in Oakhaven. It smelled the same too, that wet, heavy scent of damp earth and rotting leaves seeping through the stone walls. She turned away from the window, her heavy velvet skirts rustling softly. Lyndon sat at the center of the dais. He was 12 now. The soft, rounded cheeks of the boy who had chased chickens in the mud were gone, replaced by sharp cheekbones and a jawline that looked cut from marble. He wore a dark wool tunic devoid of excessive embroidery, and the golden crown of oak leaves rested heavily on his dark hair. He did not fidget. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the carved wooden arms of the royal seat. Below him stood a man in iron shackles. The prisoner was a merchant from the southern ports. He was trembling his expensive silk doublet stained with sweat and dirt from the dungeons. He had been caught hoarding grain during the autumn shortage, driving up prices while the common folk starved. "I was only protecting my investments." "Your Majesty," the merchant pleaded, his voice cracking. He fell to his knees, the chains clanking loudly against the stone floor. "The sea storms sank 2 of my ships. I have a family. I only meant to recoup my losses." Bexley watched her son. She watched for a flicker of empathy. She watched for the boy who used to share his stale bread with stray dogs because he couldn't bear to see them hungry. Leo leaned forward slightly. His dark eyes, so much like her own, were utterly flat. "You held 3 warehouses of wheat while the children in the lower rings of this city ate boiled leather," Leo said. His voice had not yet dropped to a man's baritone, but it carried a chilling, deadened authority. "Your investments cost me the lives of 50 taxpayers." "Mercy, your grace." The man sobbed, pressing his face to the floor. "Please, I will give the crown everything, all my ships, all my gold." Leo didn't blink. He sat back, his posture rigid. "Your gold is already mine, merchant. It was seized this morning." He looked at the captain of the guard standing nearby. "Hang him from the harbor gates. Let the seabirds have him. Let the other merchants see what happens when you steal from the crown." The guards hauled the screaming man to his feet, dragging him backward out of the hall. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off his cries with a final echoing boom. The court was dead silent. No one whispered. No one dared. They looked at the 12-year-old boy with naked, unfiltered terror. Bexley stood by the window, her hand sliding deep into the pocket of her gown. Her fingers curled around the heavy silver spoon she had stolen from Abner's estate 7 years ago. The edges were worn smooth from years of being rubbed, a constant tactile anchor to the mud she had crawled out of. She looked at Lyndon. He was efficient. He was ruthless. He was perfectly flawlessly safe. No lord would dare cross him. No council member would try to manipulate him. He had survived the viper's nest by becoming the deadliest snake in the grass. Leo turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers across the hall. For a fraction of a second, the cold mask slipped. He looked tired. He looked like a small boy wearing armor too heavy for his shoulders. He gave her a slow, barely perceptible nod. Bexley nodded back. She felt a crushing, suffocating wave of grief crash over her ribs, heavy and breathless. She had done exactly what she set out to do. She had protected him from Abner. She had protected him from poverty, from starvation, from the cruelty of powerful men. But to do it, she had systematically killed the softness inside him. She had forged him into a weapon, and weapons do not know how to be happy. They only know how to cut. She walked slowly up the steps of the dais, taking her place beside him. She reached out and rested her hand gently on his shoulder. Under the heavy wool, his muscles were tight, perpetually braced for an attack. He leaned slightly into her touch, a microscopic concession to the mother who had dragged him to the top of the world. The herald banged his staff against the floor, announcing the next petitioner. Bexley stared out at the sea of bowing nobles, the rustling silks, the gleaming gold. She tasted the bitter tang of paranoia in the back of her throat. She gripped the silver spoon in her pocket until it bruised her palm. They had the kingdom. They had the power. They had entirely replaced the Duke who threw them away, leaving him to rot in forgotten obscurity. And as the next desperate man dropped to his knees before her son, Bexley realized the ultimate tragic truth of her victory. She had conquered the monsters in the dark, only to build them a better castle. Did this dark, unforgiving journey into the heart of royal betrayal keep you on the edge of your seat? The mud of Oakhaven and the cold marble of the Sun Palace are just the beginning of the stories we have to tell. If you loved watching Bexley forge her shattered life into an empire of absolute power, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with fellow fans of gritty, emotional historical dramas. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales of vengeance, survival, and ambition. Your support keeps the stories alive.